is Stephanie Hyland. I'm a researcher in the Health Intelligence Group at Microsoft Research Cambridge. Thank you to the AMLD organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'll be talking about Context is Everything, a case study on hypertension prediction. So I'm a machine learning researcher, so my world can look a lot like this. I get some data, I'm trying to build a model, and I think a lot about how I build that model. Justifiably, I'm thinking about how can I learn from data? So thinking about the learning process, model choices, architecture choices, data engineering, data understanding, staying on top of the literature, and so on and so forth. I have a kind of narrow focus in thinking about models. When we do applied machine learning, however, we need to zoom out a little bit. We need to think, actually quite a lot. We need to think about where the data is coming from and how the model we build is going to be used. We also need to think about who is working alongside us in actually building this model. So to be more specific, when we think about where the data comes from, obviously in clinical machine learning, this is often coming from patients. In my case, it's typically coming from patients in hospitals. But there's also clinicians, caregivers, nurses and doctors involved in the creation of that data, the decision to record certain variables versus others. We also need to think about how the data is stored and how it's encoded, the types of errors that might have been introduced along the way, and all of these other pieces of context which build that data set that we then work with. And then when we think about how the model will be used, we need to think beyond I'm doing binary classification and I'm outputting a number between 0 and 1. We need to think about, well, which person is going to be looking at that number? How are they going to interpret it? Where in their workflow will they be looking at this number? Are we going to have to ask them to install an app and radically change something about the way they're working? Or can we integrate it smoothly into their existing practices? It may also be that the model is used by multiple people for slightly different reasons. So we need to understand how they might be interpreting it differently, or how it might be used perhaps in collective decision-making processes. And of course, we have to think about the patients whose lives may be impacted by the output of the model itself. So we really need to keep the big picture in mind when we're doing applied machine learning. And I think this is important, not purely because it means that we will hopefully do the right thing, but it can also help us as machine learning researchers to build our models better, to understand our data better, and to identify the theoretical challenges which are really, really important. So I said this is a case study, so I'm going to be talking about one specific problem, which is around perioperative hypertension. And just to highlight how many people are involved in these types of projects and how multidisciplinary we are, this is a collaboration between Microsoft Research in Cambridge and UW Medicine in the States. So there's a large group of people. I am but one person in this group. Everything I'll be talking about today is really a group effort from many different disciplines. Okay, so we're talking about hypertension. So what exactly is hypertension? So hypertension is the physiological state of having low blood pressure. It's not a disease per se, although it can be caused by diseases. It can be caused by multiple things, and there are also multiple different treatments for it. So the reason this is something that we would be concerned about is that you need blood pressure for your organs to function correctly. So your blood is delivering oxygen and other nutrients, and if the blood pressure drops too low, its ability to provide these nutrients can impact your organ function. So being hypertensive for an extended period of time is linked to increased risk of various downstream negative consequences, including heart attacks and other types of organ failure. And from the hospital administrator's perspective, also extended length of stay, readmission, and other bad consequences. So how you exactly define when is a patient hypertensive or not is a really complex and nuanced question. There is a trade-off between what is often a sort of protocolized approach towards healthcare, where we define fixed thresholds. It makes it a lot easier to standardize things and to provide care guidelines. But we, of course, also know that we want to personalize these things, and different people may have different thresholds at which their body can survive hypertension for extended periods of time, for example. So that said, in this project and in this talk, we're taking a protocolized approach and we're assuming that we define hypotension as having a mean arterial pressure below 65 millimeters mercury, or if not available, a different threshold on the systolic blood pressure. So this is our kind of working definition. But please keep in mind that both the length and the depth of hypotension are important clinically for these downstream consequences. Okay, so I'm a machine learner. How do I learn about perioperative hypertension? So we're focusing on the perioperative setting here, partially because we're working with a lot of anesthetists. So this is sort of their focal point in the area that they know the most about, but also because patients are at particularly high risk of hypertension after surgery. So it seems like a pretty impactful area to focus on. So in order for us to learn more about this setting, as I mentioned at the start, my collaborators, who are social scientists and user researchers, did ethnographic research where they went into the hospital, they shadowed clinicians, they observed them in their natural habitats, they did direct interviews, and they did obviously research. And this enables us to learn much more about the setting. So in particular, looking at the perioperative pathway, they did direct observations from the pre-op into the OR, focusing in particular on anesthetic procedures, into handover and recovery in the post-anesthetic care unit, as well as looking at the intensive care unit and care on the floor. They also did interviews with anesthetists of various experience levels, including as well as the PACU manager, nurses from the PACU, the OR, the ICU, and the floor, and some group interviews as well. So from all of this, they're able to do thematic analysis and pull out some of the important challenges that are arising in this work with a view to thinking about how could machine learning be used. So one of these that we chose to focus on is in the transition points. So across the patient's journey, they will move through different care teams. And what we identified is that the patient is particularly vulnerable at these points of transition. So focusing specifically on the transition from the operating room to the post-anesthetic care unit, which is a very common pathway out of the OR. We know in our data set that about 12% of patients going into the PACU will have hypertension. So this is not extremely rare. It's common enough to be of concern, although it's not so commonplace that it's expected that a patient would have hypertension in the PACU. So the PACU team needs to adapt to the patient's needs as they come out of surgery. And various things might have happened in surgery which could influence the way the PACU team needs to look after the patient. So we're focusing on timely awareness, because this will allow the PACU team to prepare so they can make sure the right drugs are available. They can think about, do we need a different set of nurses, or maybe we should put this patient in this bed because we know that this nurse is nearby. There's many different decisions that they will take into account. They may even think about, does this patient actually need to go directly to the ICU rather than the PACU? So with our understanding of the problem, we're now ready to think about how we turn this into a machine learning task. This is my sort of exciting point from the machine learning perspective. So we know that what we're trying to do is anticipate the future needs of the patient in the PACU. So we translate this into a supervised classification problem of predicting the probability that this patient will have hypertension in the PACU. So there's, as I mentioned, when we build our model, it's always possible that multiple people may use it. So this model could potentially be used at multiple points in the perioperative journey, but our focus is typically making a prediction towards the end of the patient's surgery, so that different teams, different stakeholders who might need to know, what's the risk for this patient, can be involved in a discussion where they might identify, yes, okay, this patient does seem to be quite high risk. Let's make some of those preparations in the PACU so that if the patient does become hypertensive, they can quickly treat it. So our model is not telling them, you must treat this patient, or this patient will have perhaps this type of hypertension. It's just saying this patient is at risk, maybe keep an extra eye. Okay, so now we know broadly what machine learning we want to do. Now we're ready to start looking at the data. So data understanding, data wrangling, data cleaning, this is something which many people in applied machine learning and data science may approach with some level of, say, trepidation or even resentment. So I want to say, I think this is a massively important task. going from the dump of CSV files that we might get from the hospital, of course, de-identified, to something that we can actually work with is massively important for building context in us as the data people, but also helping the rest of the team understand how this data was generated. So for us, this involved hours of meetings with the clinicians, going through every file, every column. What does this mean? How is this recorded? You know, is this put in by a human? Is it a machine? Is this categorical? What types of errors might we expect? But also doing various statistics and visualizations and building up a shared understanding of the data set, because we can sit with the clinicians and they can tell us, oh yes, of course, you know, this column should only have this type of data, but we're invariably going to find some other types of data in there, and we're also going to discover things that they themselves might not have realized about their own data. So this is a very important part of the process, and I hope that people will value it for that. Okay, so now that we've gone through our many CSV files, we've gone through the data understanding, what exactly are we working with in this project? So we have de-identified data from 2 Seattle hospitals spanning about 5 years. This is about 150,000 procedures across a very broad range of procedure categories, which corresponds to about 100,000 patients. We have the usual EHR data, so we have pre-op, intra-op, post-op, vitals, labs, treatments, demographics, procedure metadata, is it an emergency, and so on. As I mentioned, about 80% of the patients are going to the PACU after the OR, and about 12% are having a hypotensive event while they're there. Okay, so now how do we model this data? So we're taking the approach of trying to extract static features from time series data, which is always an interesting challenge. So one of the things that we learned as we learn more about the perioperative hemodynamic space is that there's different phases of the surgery from the perspective of anesthesia. And the way we would interpret blood pressure and other vitals are going to vary a lot based on which phase we're in. So these are broadly from the start of the anesthetic to the start of the incision, so sort of the start of the surgeon's part, and then the surgery itself, and then after the end of surgery to the end of anesthesia. So we divide the surgery into these 3 phases, which are not all the same size. And then we extract features from each phase. So something like various statistics, mins, means, maxes, and so on. So that we can essentially flatten our time series into a fixed size vector, combine this with our static data. So this will be our patient demographics, the procedure metadata, things like this, and then feed this into our favorite model, which is gradient boosted decision trees. Okay, so this is our modeling approach. Of course, there are other models you could use. And this is always the interesting first slide, which is the best model that I want. But this seems to work pretty well for us. So if we look at our ROC and precision recoil curves, precision recoil curves are quite important here because we have an imbalanced classification problem. So we really do care about how many unnecessary alarms we might be calling for a given level of recoil. So we're getting an AUC of about 0.82 and a reasonable trade-off between precision and recoil. So if we want to pick our operating point now, where is the trade-off? Where do we want to go? So we know that the trade-off between precision and recoil generally depends on sort of the cost of a missed case, as well as what sort of action we're incurring. So if I'm unnecessarily suggesting that a patient be treated, this can be quite harmful. Whereas if it's an extremely severe event, then of course we want the highest recoil possible. So in our case, we're thinking broadly about this preparedness. So the idea that maybe we want to do an extra check on a patient or make some drugs additionally available. So these seem like relatively cheap actions that are fairly low risk. However, what's really important, and which is not captured in any one operating point, is the actual context of the PACU. So the idea of doing an additional check on a patient may seem very low cost, but if the PACU is extremely busy already, this may not be something that they're able to do. So what we're proposing here is that we're not actually going to choose an operating point. We're not dichotomizing the output. We're going to provide a risk score so that the people who are actually using the system at the time can make a decision themselves based on the context that's available to them in real time, what they want to do with that kind of score. So the model's not directly dictating any actions. It's participating in the group discussion between all of the different stakeholders. It's providing another piece of evidence that they can take into account, given everything else they know about the situation. This is also an important way of de-risking the model. We're not picking a harsh cutoff, which could be excluding certain patients. We're simply saying, yes, this is a piece of evidence that you, the caregivers, can use as you want. So we've seen our ROC curves, and we have our numbers, but the real question is this model actually helpful? Does it help anyone? So we specify this question as, does the output of this model, this sort of risk score between 0 and 1, actually improve the performance of clinicians at predicting postoperative hypertension? This is not the ultimate judge of utility, but this is the first step towards understanding if it has utility. So we designed an experimental study where we would show clinicians patient data with an interface as similar to their usual system as we could make it. And then we asked them for the probability of postoperative hypertension, given this patient's chart, first without seeing the model's output, and then with seeing its output. So that allows us to see both what is their performance at the task, as well as does it get any better when they have access to the model. So we recruited 9 practicing OR anesthetists to review about 200 cases each. Just to show you what the tool we made actually looked like, this is completely fictional patient data, so don't worry. We're showing, so we have a sort of time series of their various vitals that they would expect in this format. We also have some metadata about the procedure. What is the procedure type? How long is this procedure going on? Because the prediction is going to be made at the end of it. Various information about labs, prior drugs, and so on. And then the big 30% there is the model's output. And then to the right, we ask them, can you give us a score, say, between 0 and 100%? So what do we find from this study? Does the model help? It does seem to. So on their own, clinicians are getting an AUC of about 0.67, which is increasing statistically significantly to 0.73 with the model, which is interestingly lower than the model on its own. But of course, there are many questions that we would need to address to understand exactly what's going on here. So this is evidence to support that the model is indeed helpful. Of course, it's not conclusive proof. We would definitely need to do further validation to explore, for example, the more realistic testing environment. So when you're actually in the OR, there's going to be various different pressures that may be impacting your ability to make the decision, but you may also have access to more data, which you didn't have access to in our sort of simplified setting. And another really interesting question, I think, is in the scenario that we showed them, they went through, say, 200 cases. They never got any feedback. So they never got to see, did the model get it right? Did I get it right? When does the model get it right? And it seems pretty reasonable that a human working alongside a model is going to eventually be able to adapt, perhaps very rapidly, to the types of mistakes that the model is making. So the combined human model system may actually improve in performance over time. And so understanding, what is the sort of the potential performance in the future as the people adapt to the model is really interesting. So as I said, this is really promising results that this system could be used as an assistive technology. So of course, there are various challenges when we start to think, okay, how would we actually test this, in a more realistic setting, as I mentioned. So of course, we've been doing all of this in the offline setting. So we received a bunch of data. We do our normal test train splits and so on, and we process the data, but it's not the real EHR system. So actually translating your model to work with the real EHR system using the compute that they have access to, or perhaps the way the data is coded is different to the way we expected it. All of these translational challenges are, of course, a huge part of getting anything to work in practice. And on top of that, of course, we need to ensure that the model itself is safe and reliable, because if it is to ever be used on anyone, we really want to stress test it to make sure that it's not going to do anything unexpected. Of course, adjusting the model itself or expanding the task to improve utility. One of the things that we learned in the user studies after the validation study was that hypotension is important, but there's other things that the PACU might want to know about, such as will they need fluids, for example, which could be really impactful to help improve the utility of the model. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning, thinking about how people would actually use this model. So at what point in the process are they potentially making that order to the pharmacy to get those drugs available? Can we make the model's output available at that time point to help them? Because if you're not building something that fits into an existing workflow or designing a new, slightly better workflow, perhaps, people are just not going to use it and it's not going to help anybody. So in conclusion, I hope that I've communicated that machine learning will always be a small or perhaps large component in a much larger socio-technical system. Learning this has been really humbling for me as a machine learning researcher, because we often come in thinking, oh yeah, we're gonna solve everything with machine learning, but actually healthcare is already massively complex, and trying to find even just a little place where machine learning can do a little bit of good is really, really important. And so understanding this context is really key for finding both the problems that are worth solving, as well as figuring out how to actually solve them. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and a small plug, we are hiring in the health intelligence team at Microsoft Research. If you're interested, check out the website or ask me. Thank you again.
Thank you, Stephanie, for this great and very interesting talk. And we have you live now for some questions. I have a question from Christian. He says, you described the elaborate process of analyzing the data sets you use and the respective columns. Would it be worthwhile to also invest this time into the definition of the phenotype, in your case, hypotension? Which fraction of the patients actually needed extra treatment in the PACU, and how many did you miss because of their individual definition of hypotension?
Great. Thanks, Christian, for this question. It almost feels like it was planted. You're asking me about my kind of favorite question of label definition. So for sure, we should be spending a lot of time in the definition of our label. I think when you're doing supervised learning, probably a lot of applied machine learning, people will come to realize that choosing the label correctly can have a huge impact on your performance. So yeah, for sure, like a lot of time should go into the definition of your label. In this particular project, I didn't talk about it so much. I kind of alluded to how, okay, yeah, this is like one definition for hypertension. You know, there's a cutoff. It's subtle. So yeah, I'm glad to be able to talk about this. Like we're very interested in trying to go beyond the label that we've used so far. So Christian, you're alluding, or you're pointing out I think the potential for like masked hypotension, where the patient could be receiving a treatment, which means that their blood pressure looks normal, but there is still hypertension going on. And this is what we did in the previous work that I did with the ETH people, where we included potentially the use of drugs at the same time as low blood pressure as an indicator for circulatory function. So this is something that we've also thought about doing in this project. In our data, the use of the drugs for hypertension in the PACU is not that common. We haven't directly tested this alternate like composite label, but we're seeing something like less than 10% of the patients are actually receiving any fluids in the PACU. So my guess is that if we did include this modification to the label, it might not make a huge difference. But we are interested in the general question of what types of hypertension are worth predicting. So if it's something which is like a very standard, you know, like everybody knows that this patient is going to become hypertensive, the drugs are on hand, you know, it's very quickly avoided, that's probably not as useful as identifying the hard cases. And this is something which came up when we did interviews with the clinicians, both before and after using the tool, that they were like, okay, I want to know about the unexpected. And that's really cool. And it's a really difficult problem, because it means that we need to now be able to model what they understand to be happening with the patient in order to identify the cases that they were not expecting. Yeah, so very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question from Simon. He says, if I understood correctly, context in your presentation refers to a human appreciation of the risk. Do you include other analytical context variables such as medical history, family, antecedents, and if so, which ones?
Yeah, so in this case, we are using some kind of pre-operative information about the patient. We're somewhat limited by the data that we have access to, as is always the case in machine learning. So we do have a bit of information about their medical history, including comorbidities. The data set that we're using, we don't have access to the medical notes for privacy reasons, so we have a somewhat more limited view of that information. We do have we have the kind of the type of procedure, and we have some of their like pre-operative baseline values. But for sure, we could add more context there on the individual patient if we had access to that data.
Great. And this is a question from me, and also as a practitioner and working in this field, I would like to ask you so that you can share with the audience what are the typical aspects of the discussions when you engage with doctors and you have this idea of creating a new machine learning model. Are there priorities that come just from the clinical side, priorities that come from your team's side with respect to what type of problem you would like to work on, and how do you bridge the gap between them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question that comes up pretty much all the time, I think, when we're working in applied research, because I think we're somewhere between going to doctors and saying, what's your problem? We'll solve it for you, which is almost like a consultancy type role, like consulting data science, perhaps. And then there's also the kind of individual research agenda that we might have, which may be perhaps further divorced from the immediate application. So the problem that I just described, it's very applied, like it's very, okay, here's hypotension, we work together to figure out the specifics of it, but from the machine learning perspective, it's very applied. Whereas we, as a research team, we also have our interests in maybe the more general problems or fundamental machine learning questions. So for example, I personally am very interested in generalization. So I mentioned here that there's 2 hospitals in this data set. So I didn't talk about it in the talk, but this is challenging and it's interesting. So how can we make sure that our model is going to be able to work on both hospitals or enable it to be fine-tunable for one? And so by working on this problem, it gives us an opportunity to explore another problem. So it's a balancing act, and I think it also depends on the team and the collaborators you're working with. And sometimes you want to have a mix of more clinical driven problems and more machine learning driven problems.